Most men who cut everyone off want you to believe they are unbothered, unreachable, above the noise. They say they protecting their peace. They claim they be outgrown people. They wear silence like a badge of honor. But here is the uncomfortable truth. Silence is not strength, and isolation is not mastery. In many cases, it is unfinished work. Isolation is often romanticized in culture. We are told that withdrawing from the world is a sign of strength, that those who distance themselves have attained clarity, discipline, or insight beyond the reach of ordinary people. I prefer solitude, some men claim, and the words are received as proof of character, as if silence alone could certify wisdom. But the truth is far more subtle, far less glamorous. Isolation is rarely a conscious choice. More often, it is a reaction or response to experiences that were overwhelming, painful, or confusing, and that a man has not yet processed fully. From a young age, many men are conditioned to suppress vulnerability. Emotional expression is discouraged. Sensitivity is mocked. The raw complexity of human feelings is either ignored or punished. When life presents betrayal, disappointment, or misunderstanding, the mind begins to calculate safety. One of the most efficient strategies the psyche can adopt is withdrawal. It is a mechanism of self-preservation if the external world consistently proves unsafe. The easiest response is to retreat. What appears to outsiders as deliberate solitude may in reality be a shield, a defense against pain, exposure, or rejection. This reactive isolation often begins quietly, almost imperceptibly. A man stops sharing his thoughts freely, begins avoiding deep conversations, or declines invitations to connect with friends and family. It feels like control at first, because distance creates the illusion of autonomy. The world cannot harm him if he does not allow himself to be touched. He may even cultivate a narrative about why he is above. Social engagement, framing withdrawal as discipline rather than defense. In this way, the psyche rationalizes avoidance, turning a reaction into a philosophy, a temporary shield into a permanent identity. Yet the reality underneath this withdrawal is often unresolved emotional tension. Fear, anger, disappointment, and confusion do not disappear simply because the doors are closed and the phone is off. They continue to echo internally, shaping perception, judgment, and behavior. In fact, prolonged isolation can exaggerate these unprocessed reactions. The mind, starved of external feedback, begins to turn inward, amplifying doubts and insecurities. Without mirrors in the form of relationships, a man loses perspective, mistaking his defensive patterns for inherent truths about the world or himself. Isolation as a reaction is also rarely uniform. It fluctuates with intensity and circumstance. A man may immerse himself in work, hobbies, or intellectual pursuits, creating a structured life that feels full but is built on the avoidance of certain emotions or people. At other times, he may experience sudden pangs of loneliness or anxiety, which reveal that withdrawal is not a position of strength, but a gap in connection. His isolation, while intentional in appearance, is reactive in essence because it is guided not by clarity, but by the desire to escape discomfort. Another key aspect of reactive isolation is projection. By cutting off relationships, men often unconsciously project their unresolved feelings onto others. They may see the world as hostile, untrustworthy, or shallow, not because these traits define others, but because their own inner conflicts have colored perception. Every slight, real or imagined, reinforces the protective distance they maintain. This projection convinces them that solitude is necessary, that the outside world is too dangerous or unworthy of engagement, further entrenching a reactionary pattern. The distinction between reactive and chosen isolation becomes clearer when considering self-awareness. Chosen solitude emerges from deliberate introspection and a conscious desire to grow in a focused space, whereas reactive isolation is defensive and often accompanied by a sense of restlessness, resentment, or fear. Men who reactively withdraw rarely examine the underlying causes of their retreat. They do not question what pain is driving them to disengage, or which relationships, experiences, or inner conflicts they are avoiding. Instead, they accept isolation as default, and it becomes a container for avoidance rather than a crucible for insight. It is also important to recognize that society often reinforces this pattern in men. There is a cultural expectation for men to handle things on their own, to maintain stoicism, and to hide vulnerability. These norms make reactive isolation appear virtuous. Withdrawal is admired in some circles as independence, in others as self-sufficiency, when in reality it is frequently a response to unresolved wounds. Men are praised for being solitary even as the root of their distance is fear, unhealed trauma, or suppressed emotion. Finally, reactive isolation can have subtle consequences on identity and psyche. Over time, retreating from others can solidify a self-image rooted in separation, reinforcing beliefs such as "I am unfit for connection," or "people will always disappoint me." These beliefs, born of reaction, are internalized and then projected outward, perpetuating a cycle of distance. Men may interpret their own withdrawal as strength, yet the very act of cutting off others often signals unprocessed struggle rather than mastery. Many men believe they are disciplined, but what they call discipline is often avoidance masquerading as control. They wake early, follow strict routines, and meticulously structure their days. On the surface, it looks impressive, focused, unwavering, self-contained. To outsiders, it appears as mastery. But beneath this exterior, the very behavior that are praised as strength may conceal a deep reluctance to face what truly matters. The routines, the schedules, the relentless productivity, these are not always signs of internal fortitude. Often, they are the armor of avoidance. Avoidance disguised as discipline begins with the recognition that life can be uncomfortable. Feelings, relationships, and unresolved experiences demand engagement, introspection, and courage. Not every truth is easy to confront, and not every emotion is convenient to feel. A man who is unwilling to sit with discomfort can craft a life that seems disciplined, structured, and controlled, yet is in reality a series of calculated evasions. The daily grind, strict habits, and carefully curated productivity give the appearance of mastery while quietly serving as a defense against vulnerability. One of the most common forms of this disguised avoidance is hyperfocus on work or achievement. A man pours energy into tasks, goals, or projects with a rigidity that seems admirable. He rejects leisure that is not productive, avoids conversations that feel emotionally risky, and limits social interactions that might trigger unresolved tensions. To him, discipline is the answer to chaos, the weapon against destruction, the proof that he is in command. Yet the reality is that his schedule shields him from facing his own interiority, from reckoning with his fears, anger, or sorrow. What looks like self-mastery is in fact a strategy to avoid confronting what truly unsettles him. The distinction between genuine discipline and avoidance is subtle but crucial. True discipline emerges from alignment with purpose, from deliberate choice, and from the courage to face both external and internal challenges. Avoidance disguised as discipline, on the other hand, is defensive, reactive, and often unconscious. It is less about self-mastery and more about self-protection. Men who practice it may not even recognize that their routines are a form of escape. Believe that the outward appearance of rigor equates to inner strength, when the inner strength they claim has never been tested by the very discomfort they are avoiding. Another layer of this pattern is the moral relation of avoidance. Discipline is framed not just as habit, but as virtue. I am strong because I do not waste time. I am in control because I adhere to my plan. These statements obscure the truth. Strength is not measured by how efficiently one avoids emotional engagement, but by the capacity to face it. Avoidance becomes socially acceptable, even admired, when it is dressed in the language of discipline. The man who avoids intimacy, confrontation, or reflection can convince both himself and others that he's principled, rigorous, and in command of his life. The more he convinces himself, the more entrenched the pattern becomes. Avoidance disguised as discipline often extends to relationships. Men may set rigid boundaries or enforce distance in ways that appear healthy or necessary, They may insist on emotional self-sufficiency, rejection of dependency, or detachment from vulnerability. These behaviors are described as discipline, but the underlying motivation is avoidance and unwillingness to engage with conflict, disappointment, or the unpredictability of human connection. True strength would allow for both structure and openness, for commitment without fear, for engagement without erosion of self. Avoidance, by contrast, limits growth while creating the illusion of control. Furthermore, the psyche often rewards avoidance disguised as discipline with a sense of superiority. By framing withdrawal or rigidity as principled behavior, a man cultivates the illusion that he is exempt from the vulnerabilities and mistakes that affect others. This self-perception reinforces distance, isolation, and inflexibility. What began as a protective strategy solidifies into identity, and the routines themselves become a form of emotional armor. Over time, boundaries between conscious choice and reactive avoidance blur, leaving a man trapped in the very discipline he believes liberates him. The most dangerous aspect of this pattern is that it can persist indefinitely without being recognized. A man may measure his life in tasks completed, goals achieved, or habits maintained, believing that discipline alone defines his strength. Meanwhile, the emotional, relational, and existential challenges that discipline cannot solve remain unaddressed. Avoidance, hidden beneath the veneer of order and productivity, quietly dictates decisions, shapes perceptions, and limits growth. Many men believe that strength is found in absence. If they remove everything that challenges, threatens, or unsettles them, they will become invulnerable. They see the world as a place of friction, and friction as weakness, so they erase it. They cut ties, retreat into isolation, and avoid confrontation, assuming that the less they engage with others, the more unshakable they become. Yet true strength is never built in erasure. It is forged in relation, in the tension and exchange that come from being present with the world and with others. The strength that depends on erasure is fragile. It is a brittle veneer that collapses under unexpected pressure. When a man eliminates all challenges, he also eliminates opportunities for growth. By removing every mirror, he loses the reflections that reveal blind spots. By cutting off relationships, he loses the friction that tests boundaries, the feedback that corrects hubris, and the confrontation that develops resilience. Strength is relational because it emerges from engagement, not avoidance. To understand this, one must first see the difference between control and mastery. Control seeks to eliminate risk, discomfort, and opposition. Mastery accepts these elements as necessary ingredients of development. A man who cuts everyone off may feel in control, but he has not mastered himself. He has only limited his exposure to challenge. The true measure of strength is not how little a man interacts with difficulty, but how skillfully he navigates it without losing integrity or composure. Relation requires vulnerability, negotiation, and compromise. Erasure requires none of these. Relationships, whether with friends, family, or colleagues, act as mirrors. They reflect the parts of us that we often deny or ignore. Without these mirrors, illusions of self-sufficiency can easily take root. A man may tell himself that he is strong because he does not need anyone, because he has eliminated conflict, because he lives in a space free of challenge. But strength that arises in isolation is self-referential. It is measured only against a limited set of experiences and criteria. Relation expands the field of challenge. It introduces unpredictability, difference, and contradiction forces that are essential to refining inner strength. Connection also fosters accountability. A man who engages with others cannot hide from the consequences of his choices. He must face disappointment, rejection, and misunderstanding. These experiences are not weaknesses. They are catalysts for growth. They test patience, integrity, and courage. A man who avoids all relational friction may feel invulnerable, but he is not tested, and what is untested cannot become reliable strength. Strength is relational because it is exercised in response to real-world pressures, not imagined threats or controlled conditions. Erasure, by contrast, often carries an illusion of simplicity and efficiency. Remove the people who provoke conflict, avoid the conversations that are uncomfortable, and life becomes orderly. But this order is deceptive. It is a surface-level calm that masks unresolved tension within. A man who has erased challenges may believe he is strong because he experiences less discomfort, but discomfort is not the enemy, it is the teacher. Relation requires courage because it demands that discomfort be encountered rather than avoided. Erasure is a retreat from this requirement, a retreat that appears as strength, but is in fact a protective illusion. Moreover, relational engagement cultivates empathy, adaptability, and depth of understanding. Strength is not measured solely by physical prowess, emotional restraint, or intellectual rigor. It is measured by the capacity to sustain integrity in the presence of difference, to maintain composure under provocation, and to respond thoughtfully rather than react defensively. A man who erases others denies himself these opportunities. He may appear controlled, but he is untested in the ways that truly matter. Even conflict, when navigated skillfully, is an instrument of growth. Disagreement forces clarity, forces articulation of values, and forces reflection on assumptions. Isolation removes these instruments from a man as life, leaving him unpracticed in the skills that define strength. Strength is relational because it is honed in the crucible of interaction, in the spaces where ego and reality meet. Erasure may shield a man from immediate discomfort, but it also shields him from opportunity. Ultimately, a man, as resilience, insight, and power are amplified, not diminished, by connection. Relation is not a liability, it is the proving ground of strength. By engaging with others, by accepting confrontation, by facing judgment, he refines the quality of his character. The stronger a man becomes in relation, the less he fears engagement, and the more durable his strength becomes. Silence has a way of magnifying what remains unexamined. For many men who retreat from the world, the absence of conversation, confrontation, and reflection creates the perfect environment for the shadow to flourish. The shadow is not a physical entity. It is the collection of suppressed emotions, unacknowledged fears, and disowned traits that the conscious self refuses to recognize. When a man isolates himself, he often believes he is protecting his mind, emotions, or reputation, but in truth, the silence allows the shadow to grow unchecked, quietly shaping thoughts, behaviors, and perceptions without notice. The danger of this growth is that it is invisible. Men who cut off relationships, avoid reflection, or suppress vulnerability often do not perceive the expansion of their shadow. In solitude, the mind is left to its own devices. Every unresolved slight, every buried resentment, and every hidden fear accumulates. Left unexamined, these elements take on lives of their own. The longer a man avoids engagement, the more the shadow influences his decisions, subtly guiding his attitudes toward others, distorting judgment, and amplifying inner conflicts. What begins as protective silence often becomes a breeding ground for bitterness, rigidity, and self-deception. The shadow thrives in the absence of external mirrors. Relationships, conversations, and even casual interactions act as reflections, revealing blind spots that the conscious mind cannot see alone. Without these reflections, a man can easily mistake his defensive patterns for identity, his fears for principles, and his judgments for truth. Silence does not provide clarity, it provides echo chambers where internal narratives repeat endlessly, unchallenged by the perspectives of others. The shadow grows because it is unchallenged. It becomes louder not in volume, but in the persistence and certainty of its influence. Men often mistake their shadow for independence or depth. The darker, unacknowledged aspects of the self are compelling precisely because they feel private, autonomous, and unassailable. In isolation, the mind finds freedom to entertain fantasies of control, superiority, and invulnerability. Resentments that might have been aired in dialogue instead harden into principles. Fears that might have prompted learning instead calcify into avoidance. The shadow grows silently, not because it is inherently strong, but because it faces no resistance. Another critical aspect is that the shadow, as influence, is often paradoxical. It can make a man appear disciplined, decisive, or confident, while simultaneously eroding the subtle qualities that define genuine strength, empathy, openness, and self-awareness. A man may project calmness, yet harbor simmering resentment. He may claim certainty, yet be secretly driven by fear. The shadow does not announce itself. It manifests in patterns of avoidance, defensiveness, and projection. Silence becomes a petri dish in which these patterns thrive, quietly shaping the psyche in ways that are difficult to reverse. The growth of the shadow is also cyclical. Avoidance encourages silence. Silence encourages suppression. Suppression encourages further avoidance. Each cut-off relationship, each unspoken emotion, each unexamined impulse feeds the cycle. Over time, the shadow becomes a private authority dictating reactions, shaping perceptions, and even redefining values. A man may sincerely believe he is acting out of clarity, discipline, or principle, yet many of his decisions are influenced by unacknowledged elements of the self. The more isolated he becomes, the more these elements gain power, operating beneath consciousness, invisible yet potent. It is important to recognize that the shadow is not inherently destructive. Its growth becomes dangerous only when it is ignored, misunderstood, or denied. When faced and integrated, the shadow is a source of insight, strength, and creativity. But in silence, it is unopposed, and its development is skewed toward rigidity, fear, and projection. A man who retreats from connection without reflection is vulnerable not because he is weak, but because he is unknowingly governed by unseen forces. In this way, the shadow transforms the interior landscape of a man who seeks refuge in isolation. It redefines his emotional range, limits his perspective, and distorts his perception of others. He may interpret his avoidance as wisdom or control, yet the shadow as influence ensures that what appears to be clarity is often partial, biased, or self-serving. In silence, the internal landscape becomes overgrown, obscuring the conscious mind and dictating behaviors that are misaligned with true intentions. Over time, the shadow's growth in silence can lead to a paradoxical form of vulnerability. Men who believe themselves untouchable because they have removed external threats may find that the most formidable challenges are within. Fear, anger, resentment, and unacknowledged desires exert influence precisely because they have been left unspoken, unexplored, and unexamined. The longer silence persists, the more power these hidden elements accumulate, shaping a man as responses, relationships, and life path without his conscious awareness. Loneliness is often mistaken for depth. Many men equate being alone with being profound, as if removing oneself from the world automatically grants wisdom, insight, or strength. They isolate themselves, believing that silence and distance confer authority over life, emotion, or thought. Yet loneliness by itself is not depth. It is only a potential and opportunity. Depth is not measured by the hours spent in isolation, nor by the absence of companionship. It is measured by the insight, understanding, and transformation that emerges from the experience of being alone. Without this inner work, loneliness becomes a trap, a space of stagnation rather than growth. At its core, loneliness is a mirror. It reflects the unprocessed parts of the self that are often overlooked when surrounded by distractions or the demands of others. In solitude, a man is confronted with his thoughts, desires, fears, and unresolved experiences. If he engages with these reflections, loneliness becomes fertile ground for self-discovery. He begins to see patterns in his behavior, motivations behind his choices, and the subtle influences of emotion that have gone unnoticed. Insight grows when attention is given to these reflections, when honesty replaces rationalization, and when observation transforms into understanding. However, most men who claim loneliness as depth fail to do the inner work. They sit alone not to explore themselves, but to escape others, to avoid discomfort, or to preserve a fragile sense of control. They believe that removing external influence is sufficient for growth, yet depth cannot exist in a vacuum. The mind, when left unchecked, tends to cycle through narratives of grievance, fear, and projection. Thoughts can become echo chambers, reinforcing unchallenged assumptions and amplifying perceived injustices. Loneliness without reflection does not clarify, it distorts. It produces neither insight nor wisdom, only an inflated sense of self-sufficiency and misunderstood profundity. True depth requires confrontation with the self. It demands the courage to examine not only what is visible and convenient, but also what is hidden, uncomfortable, or shameful. A man who uses solitude merely as avoidance may feel he is introspective, but he is often skimming the surface, engaging selectively with aspects of himself that are comfortable or flattering. Real insight comes when one faces the complexity of emotion, the contradictions in behavior, and the uncomfortable truths about desire, fear, and motivation. Loneliness becomes a teacher only when it compels this confrontation, when it illuminates the dark corners of the psyche rather than allowing them to fester. Another dimension of this is relational perspective. Depth is amplified when solitude produces understanding not just of the self, but of the self in relation to others. A man who withdraws and reflects only on his own experiences while ignoring the interdependence of relationships risks cultivating self-centeredness rather than wisdom. True insight recognizes patterns in how he interacts, how he reacts under stress, and how his internal states shape the lives of those around him. Loneliness becomes productive when it encourages understanding of these relational dynamics, revealing both strengths and blind spots that remain invisible in the noise of constant engagement. Time alone is only meaningful when it is purposeful. Hours, days, or even years of solitude will not produce depth without conscious reflection, deliberate observation, and honest evaluation. Insight requires attention, curiosity, and courage, the courage to face fear, disappointment, and the less flattering parts of oneself. It requires humility, the willingness to acknowledge mistakes and patterns that require change, and the patience to allow self-understanding to develop gradually. Depth is a process, not a status, and loneliness is the medium through which the process is accessed, not a guarantee of the outcome. Furthermore, solitude without insight can breed illusion. A man may mistake his isolation for superiority, believing that disengagement makes him above the distractions, weaknesses, or limitations of others. He may confuse absence of influence with clarity, silence with wisdom, and emotional detachment with mastery. Without reflection, the mind fills the void with stories, rationalizations, and selective truth that reinforce ego rather than illuminate understanding. Loneliness becomes a stage for projection, exaggeration, and stagnation rather than a crucible for growth. Insight transforms loneliness into depth. It creates the ability to recognize recurring patterns, understand motivations, and respond consciously rather than react impulsively. It fosters empathy, not just for oneself but for others, and it cultivates resilience, clarity, and integrity. Depth emerges when solitude is leveraged as a tool for self-mastery, reflection, and relational awareness, rather than being mistaken for inherent strength or wisdom.